So we're currently in Phoenix, Arizona, and this is our second episode of the rebrand of Fearless Impact. And I am so grateful to have Jacob on the podcast.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
We only met recently, and we actually met because of a really good mutual friend of ours, Kai. And it was funny because I definitely don't meet many guys in Arizona that I'm like, oh, like super cool, could hang out with, like could see us being besties. And I feel like it was like really refreshing to me because you are young, you're ambitious, but you're also really like conscious and spiritual.
Oh, I appreciate that. Yeah, can be tricky, I feel like, to find people, but they're out there somewhere.
Yeah, and I think it's really about who you surround yourself with, and then you naturally see their tribe.
Oh, 100%. It's like that whole idea of like whatever you vibrate at, or like that's who you attract.
Yeah.
To some extent or another, right? So I noticed that, at least for me, as I've worked on like changing my internal world, like just different people get drawn into life, and that's just a continual process. So like everyone, the world's your mirror. Like however you are internally will be reflected back just through people or events or like that kind of thing, you know?
And when did you feel like you started working on your internal world?
It was definitely, it's kind of a mixed answer. So I grew up Mormon up until about 4-ish years ago at this point. So around COVID time is when I like made the mental decision to leave. But before that, I was very, very devout and did work on my internal world a lot, but through the lens of that church. And it did teach me a lot of interesting things, but I would say I really started taking it seriously after I left, because there was a lot of deconstruction that needed to happen to just like really, I guess, find myself. Because things about like with churches like that, you don't really realize like how integral it is into every part of your life until you leave. And then you're like, oh, like this dogma influenced so many different aspects. Like, who really am I? And that deconstruction process can be pretty brutal, but coming out the other end of it, like, you know a lot more about yourself, that's for sure. But there was definitely a point in time where it was really hard, and I was definitely attracting people that were in that like mind. And then as I've continued to work on it more, I've noticed that like the people in my life have been changing towards what I feel like is more authentic to me. So there's not necessarily like a good or a bad thing with these people. It's more just like who is more in tune with who I am, and like who is more in tune with how I actually feel, and like these people are actually going to accept you, kind of thing. So that's like the positive, I think, of doing the internal work.
I so see that. I see that so rapidly the last 12 months of just how my does it all the time, see? I have to be careful. How my friend circle has just been the caliber of the people. I'm just like, wow, this is the people that are really going to challenge me. And I did not feel that in Australia. And I think the first year in America for me was like super just like go with the flow. Like I really wasn't, I was in survival, but I was also like in like, I'm just going to live in my boyfriend's world because I don't have a world here yet. And I don't really like want to go and like go out on my own and figure that out. So there was a lot of like this year deconstructing, like attaching yourself to a codependent relationship, even if it was unconscious, because I didn't feel safe in the US.
What was that process like for you?
It was really interesting because I started reading a book about codependency. And I was like, wow, like I didn't think I really knew what codependency was until my most recent ex. He would say to me, I miss you even when we were together. I think it got to the point where he had his own reasons. And a part of that is like losing your mother so young. He had this fear that I was going to like, you know, whatever could happen to me, or, you know, I was going to leave, or like I could feel it inside of him. And then for me, I was like, I felt safe when I was with him. And I think when the relationship wasn't working anymore, it was easier to stay because I was so wrapped in his world. Like all of his friends were my friends, you know, like, and, you know, I obviously loved him so much, but at the same time I was like, if I want to take my life to the next level, I know this relationship has to end, because he was a social butterfly and I knew I needed to put in a season of sacrifice if I really wanted to be like with a unicorn company and being like everything that I'm doing now with DFX. There's a world that I could have done that with him, but there would have been FOMO, resentment, because we lived such different lives. And I think that's what I've appreciated now, is like I appreciate me actually living on my own terms, not because someone else has a commitment that they really want me to show up to. And I think in my new relationship or my new partner, I really want this ability. It's like no is so normalized, no is okay.
No, very much agreed. So something that's always been kind of interesting to me, and you mentioned it earlier in that point, is like this idea of him being scared of losing you, basically. And then that manifests eventually into him losing you.
Yeah.
Funny enough, right? Because it's like if we hide in those like fears for so long, like people can sense that, whether like consciously or subconsciously, and in a way, like it will kind of push them away, or there'll be a reason to be pushed away. Not to say that that was the reason here, because I don't know the full context of everything, but yeah, I know, like different relationships for different seasons of life. Like that point in time, it seemed like it was great, but then you grew, and now you got to find someone that'll grow too.
Yeah. And I think that going back to what you had mentioned about, you know, obviously leaving the Mormon church.
So for Mormon missions, for those who aren't familiar, they're 2-year service missions. So you don't get paid. You actually pay to go on them. And I know, right? she's going, huh?
You paid?
Yeah, you pay like upwards of like 10 grand if I remember correctly. So yeah.
What a great cult.
I know, right? No, literally. They pay you pay them to do door-to-door sales for them.
I love that for them.
I know, right? It's
Beautiful
like,
business model.
that's what I'm saying. There's so much we can learn. But it was always like, it's such a glorified thing in the church, and especially for men, it's very much like well, we're not requiring you to go, but if you don't go, then we're going to shun you. And so it was this feeling of like, I honestly was a huge fan of the doctrine and theology in general. So I was like, oh, this would be fun. You know, it's an opportunity to just like really deepen my relationship with Christ. But then in the same vein, it's like you get out there and you're doing stuff. And for me, I was in Arkansas, Missouri, and Oklahoma. And so it was a lot of other Christians that I would end up talking to. And it was this feeling of like, oh, shit, well, there's other beliefs besides mine. And then I have to convince people that my beliefs are better than their beliefs, but we all believe in the same book. And then that was the start of at least that deconstruction process. But
what was that mission like? Because I am very new to the whole Mormon culture. Like I went to Salt Lake City and I loved my experience there. Like I had the best time. Some of my, you know, one of my best business friends, he's Mormon. So I have no judgment. Like, you know, we all are a part of some kind of cult, whether we're aware of it or not. But I'm just kind of more of like a curious lens of just really not knowing. Like, what was that experience like briefly? And then what was it that made you like fully kind of, I don't know, like not want to be a part of that anymore?
I get that. Good questions. And honestly, for a business partner friend who's probably listening to this, I have got no beef against the church. Like, it's one of those things that I feel like in every faith and in every religion, potentially controversial take, if you dive deep enough into the theology of the religion or the history of the religion, you eventually run into this like wall of faith where it's like the facts and the logic line up only so far. And then there really does hit a point where it's like, I have to have faith in like the theology that I'm being taught, because it doesn't line up with the history anymore. And like we can try and make it work, but it does fall on to more on the tradition side than on the like factual side of things. So in brevity, like that's why I ended up leaving. But I think the culture of the church and like the community of the church and the things that they teach generally are pretty solid. Like culture wise, everyone's super friendly, especially if you're active in the church and like participating. It's amazing. But then it's like the leaving the church that can be really tough, because it's like, oh, well, all of a sudden now you're shunned in the community because you no longer have the same beliefs. But
That's intense.
yeah,
How was that? Like, what was that conversation, or what was that process?
it was like a so I will say, like, Jehovah's Witnesses definitely have it worse than we do. Like the ex Mormon community and the ex Jehovah's Witness community, and actually the ex Muslim community too, all kind of have a little bit of like intertangling and talking. Like when I initially left the church or was planning on leaving the church, I went on to like the ex Mormon subreddit and I was like, oh, whoa, like these guys are a little bit more intense than like for my liking. But I also asked them, because, okay, so here's my like approach towards religion, because it's taught as truth, and like it's taught through the lens of like, no, this is how like it actually is. Like this is reality, right? And if that's the case, like I love science also. And I kind of look at religion like chemistry, where it's like, well, if this is true, then it should be able to be held up no matter what amount of scrutiny you put it under, because it's truth. And you can like put it in the fire and it'll come out okay. And then anything that's not true will get burned away. And so when it came to Mormon doctrine, I was like, well, let's take like some of the core fundamental beliefs of like Joseph Smith being a prophet and the Book of Mormon being true, and like question them from every angle honestly. Like, is there a level of faith and justification that I'm putting here, or is this like an honest take? And so through that process, I was like, well, or through that mindset, I basically went to ex-Mormon subreddit. There's a bunch of stuff that happened. And I guess quick recap to leading up to this point of going on Reddit. I had gotten back from my mission in like 2018, moved to Utah, was in Utah for a year and a half, and then COVID happens. I moved back to Arizona, and then my family starts going through a divorce, and I'm like, you know what? If I'm going to like really stay on this religion, like something that I genuinely want to believe in, then I really should give it like an honest investigation. Because on my mission, I argued with enough preachers to hear like just about every angle of like anti-Mormon doctrine that you can hear. And on the mission, like
What would you argue about though?
oh, like everything, like
Really?
the nature of God, like is a pretty big one actually.
Was there anyone else that had your similar mindset?
Like yes and no. Like I would say like an apologist in like a broad sense has a very similar mindset of like, well, for me, I was doing a lot of apologetics when I was out there. So apologetics, for those of you who aren't familiar, is just like defending the faith, but from like the lens of you just learn a lot about the faith. And so then like someone's like, well, what about if someone like, you know, deletes themselves? Like where does their soul go? And it's like, well, from the Mormon perspective, I have the answer. The Mormon perspective is they're fine. They go to like this place called the spirit world and goes from there. But if you ask like a Catholic, and I'm not sure if this is in line with current Catholic theology, but at the time, to my understanding, like they go to hell basically because God doesn't like that. And then you have to do some sort of work to pull them out of it, or purgatory or whatever, right? And so every church has a little bit of a different belief. And for an investigator or for someone who's looking to switch religions, questions like that are important. So it's like the nature of God. Most Christians believe that in the Trinity model, which is where they're all the same person. Like God, Jesus, and the Holy Ghost are all the same person, just expressed in different ways. And then the Mormons believe that God, Jesus, and the Holy Ghost are three separate individuals. And the funny thing about the Bible is that you can argue both ends of the spectrum and have pretty compelling evidence on both sides. And then it really just depends, like, what do you choose to believe in?
That's so true. And I appreciate your honesty, because I don't feel like many people talk about this. And I think to me, it's like, I don't matter what skin color, what gender, what, nationality, like so on and so forth. But like, to me, whatever you believe in, that's beautiful. Like, you have your own opinions, your own modeling of the world. Like, I don't think there should be any judgment towards what religion or whether you are or you were. Like, to me, I don't think it really matters in the grand scheme of things. It's good that you believe in something.
Agreed. No, very much so.
Yeah.
Like, I'm at this point in time, I'm very much convinced that we all believe in the same thing. Like, God is the same for all of us. It's felt the same too. Like, if you ask any believer, they're like, I feel it in my heart. Like, I feel it in my body when I'm connecting to God. And whether that's a Muslim saying they feel it through their prayers or a Mormon when they go to the temple, it doesn't really matter because it's that same feeling that we're connecting to.
Yeah.
And so we're just using different language to describe the same phenomena.
So would you say now you're spiritual?
I would say so.
Yeah.
As like a broad sense, because like I would be considered agnostic, but like
Yeah.
the spiritual community probably has some of the better language for understanding this, but in the same vein, like the spiritual community is very broad
Yeah.
with their belief.
Yes.
And religion is very narrow with their belief.
Yes.
But I think if we can find like a medium approach, I think that would be more of like a middle way approach to this. Because like faith, humility, diligence, reverence, like those elements from religion, if you apply them in the world of spirituality, will get you the same result that religion brings.
Yeah.
But now it's more flexible and you can kind of work with God in a way that makes more sense to you.
I love that.
Thanks.
That's beautiful. And so let's dive into your mushroom and psilocybin adventure. How did this come up for you?
So it was for those of you who've known me in the past, this is probably going to be at this point in time, it might not actually be a pretty big shock, but I'm already picturing all of like the adults in the church that I was friends with when I was a kid. So yeah, I've tried mushrooms a decent amount of times now, and you're probably like, oh my gosh, why would you do that? But funny enough, it's one of those things that's like, well, we all take Adderall, and that's way worse for us than mushrooms are. Just side note, do your research. But when I left the church initially, I left it for two reasons. The first one was because of like a logical reason, but the second and more main one was as I had prayed, I had felt very specifically that I needed to investigate and then that I needed to leave, which didn't make any sense to me at the time and actually was pretty hurtful because I was like, wow, God, like I put so much trust in you and now you're leading me away from the only thing that gave me comfort. And like, that's kind of fucked up, right? And so I had left and moved to Scottsdale and I fell into like a super deep depression because I realized like I can't really talk to my friends in the church about this because all they're going to say is like, well, dude, just go back to church and then your problem's solved, right? Which, yeah, I could see that. But like, I was so deep down this logic route that I couldn't sit in church anymore and be like, oh, I believe in what you're saying. Like it wasn't true to me anymore. And I felt like that wasn't a fair thing for them who still had faith. I didn't want to tear down their faith and put them through the same thing that I was going through. And so, point being, all of this led me to be very depressed, very isolated. And for a while, it got me into therapy, which was helpful initially. Like, it's really interesting to see the way that the brain works. And funny enough, I think psychology and spirituality or religion are like two sides of the same coin, like trying to understand the same thing coming from two different angles. So that was interesting to me. But I brushed a point in my own therapy process where I was like, I'm like not getting better. Like I'm somewhat stabilized, but like not really. And so it just kept getting worse and worse to the point of like just not wanting to leave my house or leave my bed and just stay in bed all day and just veg out. And I was like, well, I could try to find a psychiatrist, but I grew up naturopath, which is like natural medicine. And so I was like, well, let me see if there's like a natural solution to this. And for those of you who don't know too, Mormons are very, very against drugs. It's funny because like they can say, "Oh, coffee is bad for you." Why is coffee bad for you? Well, on the faith spectrum, it's because Joseph Smith said so. On the logic spectrum, it's like maybe caffeine question mark. But then you have like 50 million soda shops all around
Yeah.
Utah that are doing way more harm to your body than coffee will. And so it's yeah, the logic there is interesting, but
Your first mushroom journey,
yes.
what was the date?
Okay, date I can't remember, but
Year?
year about 2 years ago.
Okay.
So
And how did you feel? Was it a microdose?
no, so in brevity to kind of finish up that story, got was investigating like alternatives to helping with depression, and I had read in the YouTube comment section that like, and I'd seen this in a couple different places. People were like, "Oh my gosh, like one mushroom experience cured my depression," and I was like, "That sounds like bullshit," but you know what? At this point, I don't care, so I'll just try it. And so I grew some and then tried it, and it changed my life for the better. Oh, actually, that's a lie. I didn't grow any at that point. Someone had given me some, and I was hesitant at first. I did about a gram, and it was the craziest thing in the world to me. It was the same exact feeling that I had felt when I was in the church, like identical, except now it was amplified. And that feeling was this feeling of like God or wholeness or presence or like love for everyone. And I was like, wait a second, like this one, this makes sense why it cures depression, because it's like depression is such a like pit of I don't see light anymore. Like it just feels like pure darkness. And so having a perspective shift from a mushroom journey where it's like there is still light in the world and there is still this interconnectedness with everything gives you contrast in that darkness. And you're like, wait a second, I actually see differently now. And so for me, like 2 years ago, that being the first experience, I was like, oh my gosh, like I see what they mean now. And I went back to therapy, and whatever I was working on that week, I can't remember, but my average turnaround time from being like, you know, maybe a month-ish to like really work through an issue turned into like 2 weeks. And then as I continued my like medicinal usage of them, my recovery time got faster and faster and faster until it was like 1 week, and then it turned into like a couple days, and then it turned into like a day, and then it was turning into like I would go to therapy, we'd find something, I would journey on it or meditate on it outside of therapy, and I'd be like done and basically just give the therapist like a rundown of what I did on my own. And then therapy sessions started turning into that, where it was just like, hey, this is what I did and what I found. And I'm like, oh, okay, yeah, you're on the right path. And then just like, it turned less into like, what do I do? And then more into like, oh, good job.
I love that. That's so interesting. And so, what does that journey look like for you? And what is kind of like, is there anything like else that you go in with that journey, like an intention? What does that kind of process look like getting ready for a journey?
I would say it really just kind of depends. Like for people now that would ask me advice on what to do, it would be more along the lines of like, well,
no, I don't want your advice.
Okay.
I want, what do you do? Like, what was your kind of like those experiences where you're going back to your therapist? What would that look like for you going through that journey?
So it would look like, so a good example then would be at one point I was really angry with God, and I would consider myself like an atheist. And so a really pivotal point for me was switching from atheist back to kind of agnostic. And it was interesting because that process was a process of like, I was taking this intention into a journey of like, I want to, basically know like if you're real or not, and like, how do I connect with you? And it was just its own beautiful experience. Like this is one that had accumulated over multiple experiences and still kind of accumulates to today. But that first initial asking was like this very beautiful feeling of just like connectedness. And then that started leading me to being like, oh, okay, well, I am interacting with something. There is a God out there, or some sort of like God is the best language that we have to describe it, I think.
Yeah.
I don't think it's the most accurate language though. And so
For me, I say higher power.
Yeah, exactly. High power, universe, source. Like it feels much more all encompassing than just like a man in the sky.
Yeah.
And yeah, so my main intentions using it now are almost consistently to try and connect with that more. And what that leads me to is always to some form of internal work because
Wait, one question though. I know you obviously do the microdosing capsules. Is this more of a fuller dose?
both ends.
But would you say that the journey that you're speaking about is just the micro, or is it actually the
More macro.
yeah?
So there's and I guess for some context, there's like 3 levels to dosing and using mushrooms. Like you can do micro, which is considered between like 0.1 to 0.3, which is like 100 milligrams, 300 milligrams. A full trip would be like 3.5 grams, so like significantly more. And then there's like medium amounts of like 0.5 to 1 gram. And each of them provide different levels of perspective. And so something that I've noticed pretty consistently with me is that my connection to God is entirely determined by how good my internal work is. Like if I have fear and shame and guilt and those types of things that are clouding my inner judgment, it becomes much harder to feel God. And so the larger doses are helpful because it can show you like, hey, this thing is bothering you. The medium doses are helpful because they're right on that cusp of not quite going on a full experience, but also not quite in reality. And so you can integrate a little bit better. And then the microdoses are great for the day-to-day, where it's like, okay, I know that for me, for example, like maybe anxiety around relationships or things like that. It's like, oh, now I see that this bothers me. And the micros in the day-to-day are very helpful with like reminding me, hey, like you don't have to worry about that basically. And you can heal through it. And then like as you're interacting with new stimuli, it allows you to choose new options of how you want to react to it better, if that makes sense.
No, it does. Yeah, that does make sense. And I love that. I think that's really clear on like the experience of each. And I think I'm curious of like the research on like, obviously right now in America, it's illegal.
Mm-hmm.
What state is it that it's becoming
like decriminalized?
Yeah, there's something going on with that.
To my understanding, Colorado and Oregon are both pretty open to it. California's getting on that train too, which, you know, shocker, right? But funny enough, one that I'd heard that I haven't actually looked into yet was Washington, D.C. I know, right? It's like out of all fucking places.
True, like I love America.
I know, right? Well, actually, some potentially good news for us. Robert Kennedy has been a big advocate for psychedelics, and knowing his past of like being a former addict and things like that, like microdosing and macrodosing and just psychedelic usage as a whole, we look back in like the 60s and 70s when it was legal, like the most groundbreaking research on PTSD and things like that, and just amazingly helpful. So I think it's just a matter of time, but right now it is still illegal for some reason.
Actually, on that note, PTSD, there's one of my friends who invested in DFX. He has a business that is specifically for like veteran, like kind of like homes, you know, for when they're older. I feel like that would be such a good niche for you.
Yeah, no, I think that the veteran community is one that can genuinely deeply benefit from work like this. Like, they're so tossed aside in everything, it's kind of ridiculous. Like, when I was in Missouri for the missionary work, like, there was actually a fair amount of veterans out that way that were just kind of living off of Social Security because they had received injuries or whatnot. But you could see how, like, war PTSD affected every facet of their life. And like PTSD as a whole is very much like living in a mental hell. Like, to use scripture analogy, like heaven and hell I think are mental states more than like actual places. And they can very much be experienced here on earth, both of them. Because just as much darkness as there is in life, there is as much light, and vice versa. And so with PTSD and with veterans, it's sad because like they serve the country and they get propped up enough, but then like they don't get taken care of at all when they leave. They just get kind of kicked to the curb, and it's pretty fucked up if you ask me. So I think them especially can really genuinely benefit from all of this stuff. So
I agree. And right now, I know we know there's only certain things that we can kind of go into, but how is kind of like your journey in this world? Like, what is it like now, and how do you kind of want it to be in like the next couple of years?
So this is the exciting part for me because like the longer that I'm in this space, the more I'm seeing how much lack of innovation there is, which to me is exciting because I love innovating things. And at least when it comes to, there's two elements here. One that seems kind of being like a heathen, but I promise is worth it. And the other one just interesting in the mushroom end of things. But like on the spirituality element, like religion and spirituality, I think should go hand in hand a lot more than they do right now. Like if we are really looking for truth and the truth of how to connect with God accurately and consistently, and like no matter who you are or what you believe in, you can connect with them, then there's gotta be like fundamental principles ingrained in everything that we teach. And the only difference is the language on how we use to describe it. So like, can we compile all that together into like a program to almost like systematize spirituality? And that's like a more couple years goal, because I have had some success with it already, where it's like intuition is a pretty good word for what we feel like is that voice of God almost, because we feel it in our head and in our heart, and it's unique to us, and it's always like a no, you specifically need to do this, and then like you do it and then you feel great, and like your intuition never leads you astray, or the voice of God or the Holy Spirit never leads you astray. It's the same thing. And so like more conversations around that I think could help all of us to grow, because like right now we're dealing with AI, like the machines are growing and evolving, but us humans haven't really done anything. Like how do we grow and evolve? Like we have the tools for it, which is kind of where mushrooms and other psychedelics come into play. Like when used properly, they can be amazing instruments for human growth and human potential. Like this gift of consciousness, this gift of having this life, we've just barely started to understand. We're still just very, very at the start of it. And if we believe that we know everything, then it stops us from actually learning more. Like, you can't be a real scientist if you think that everything that you're saying is 100% true and that you're 100% accurate on everything. Because, like, where's the fun in that? You don't have any room for exploration and growth.
Yeah.
So, yeah, if we approach that same level with spirituality, then we lose our ability to grow and evolve. So, over the next couple years, part of the mission is to explore that and to try and systematize the religious end of things, because I think that'd be really helpful. And then
When you say systematize, what does that mean?
so there's like this concept that I really like and that I've been using to kind of help filter, but like the 80-20 rule. And for those of you who aren't familiar, it's like 20% of the work produces 80% of the results in just about any given category. And so with spirituality, I think you can apply the same rule, where 20% of spiritual practices provide 80% of spiritual results, which are peace, connection with God, connection with others, like lasting self-transformation, like all these things that religion provides and offers, and same thing with spirituality. But ask anyone that's left a religion or even left spirituality, and it's like, yeah, most of the stuff that we talk about doesn't really need to be worried about. So like, what is that 20% that actually provides results? And it's like, let's take like a meditation or like a stillness, for example. Like prayer and meditation can be seen as the same thing in my mind, because they both operate on this like sense of stillness. They both operate on this like, I'm being still and I'm trying to connect with God. And through that process, you connect more with God. And so that's part of what it means, I think, to systematize it. And then where mushrooms and microdosing are beneficial is they help make those feelings and those like connections to God stronger. And so when you're going down this route, because another thing that's really common in religion and spirituality is people that are like, it just doesn't come to me naturally, and it's going to take a lot of work for me to like connect to it. But I have seen people that have been in that situation still connect to God. It just takes some time because they're just not familiar with it. No problem for them, right? But using a tool like some sort of psychedelic can be really helpful in like boosting that signal, so to speak. And then you implement proper discipline or proper like regimenting, and then that connection grows stronger. And so it really just is a matter of like, can we create some sort of universal language to explain what we're going through? And then from there, like, systematize its interaction. So through meditation, through things like being humble and being patient, having love for other people, like those are all things that you can very universally bring into your life. And whether you choose to be religious or not doesn't really matter. You can still keep your religion and follow these beliefs. And your connection to God in said religion will grow stronger. Like your religion is just the language that you're using to communicate with God. So if we learn more languages, we can communicate with God in a bunch of different ways and more accurately get to know him or her.
I didn't realize how much of your, I guess, psilocybin and mushroom work, even though you left the Mormon church, still is around spirituality and God. I think that's really interesting. I had no idea.
Yeah, I honestly am kind of surprised with like the lack of God and spirituality in like the psilocybin world. There's a
I think that there is. I just don't know if they necessarily refer it to God.
exactly,
Yeah.
which is like this big disconnect between the two, because you get people that leave religion and religion scars them so deeply that they're like, I just can't use any of that anymore. You like throw the baby
Right.
out with the bathwater.
I also think for me though, I think that God has become a word for me that is very much like related to these very intense, different verticals that I think it's like, it's kind of for me, I like the word higher power because I don't even know if I necessarily think it's a man or it's a be like, do you know what I mean?
Yes.
So I think for me it's more like mother nature and like, just like different elements of the universe. And so I do think that God has this kind of, I don't know, it's like this different association than spirituality. But I think it's really interesting how you didn't let everything that you went through dictate your lens like moving forward. So I think you should be so proud of yourself for that.
Thank you.
This is so unique.
Honestly, I will say for a nice chunk of time, I was definitely part of that group that was like, no, God's not real.
Of course.
And like, I hate him or her or whatever you want to call it.
Right.
Like, I'll reference it in both pronouns because in my mind, I don't think it has a gender. Like, I think it's very close to like a universe or a source mentality. But God is such a like charged word, like you said, that like I want to use it in different ways to show people that it can be diverse. Like, we can talk about the same thing. We don't have to be like Democrats versus Republicans when we talk on the topic of God. Like, let's not be so diehard in our beliefs that we lose sight of the truth.
So agree. I think there's so much hecticness in this space, and I think you just like beautifully explained your perspective in such a like, I don't know, like it's such a eye-opening conversation, I think, for a lot of different religions out there, no matter what your background is like, you can believe in it, you cannot. But at the end of the day, I think that not many people can go through what you went through and not have judgment towards the word.
Agreed. Well, I mean, like, and that's kind of the crazy thing is I 100% did, but it was exposure to psychedelics that allowed me to approach it from this angle. Because it's just like, it's so sad when it's like the beliefs that, like, for example, like Muslims praying all the time and then visiting Mecca. Like, how cool is that? Like, to have such deep devotion to God that you feel compelled to do these types of things through the structure of Islam. Like, that's beautiful. For the Mormons with temples, for Christians with pilgrimages and missions, like all these kinds of things. Like, we do so many amazing things in the name of God. But at the same time, those traditions have their flaws, no matter how you want to look at it, and generally can cause a lot of harm too. And so it's like, can we just strip away the things that do harm, leave what's good, Because, I mean, at the end of the day, I think God just wants us to connect with it. And overall, just be a part of it. Because we're all, like, we can connect to each other through God, is kind of how I look at it. We all share, like, nowadays, my belief is a little bit more along the lines of we all kind of come from the same thing, and we're just, like, different expressions of the same thing. And so in that way, we are all connected to at some level. And I think all religion, when you dive deep enough into it, teaches the same morals. But they're just flavored differently, I guess, depending on what region of the world you're in. But we live in a connected age, so we should build like a connected way of belief.
And curious, what is your most active social media channel at the moment? Is it Instagram?
It is, but I am trying to do more of this type of stuff on TikTok. And I actually had a conversation with a guy last night who had a pretty big following at one point and then is now rebuilding it too. And so I hope to like spur a lot of these conversations more on TikTok and probably on Instagram too, but TikTok is most likely the channel, and then YouTube as well. So
I love that. Well, I'll link that below, and thank you so much for jumping on the pod.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Good.
Yeah.
Yeah. Uh-huh.